Okay, cool, thank you. So now you know I'm Simon and I'm from Sweden. I'm a developer normally, but I also really enjoy languages and figuring out ways to try to entertain you. So let's see how that goes. And if you have read the title ahead, you might have noticed that it's kind of hard to guess what this is all about. How does this make you empowered? And maybe pets die, maybe this hits you in the feels, sorry, but it's also for a good reason. So the takeaways of this session are increasingly important because of the state of the world, let's say. And it's important that these ideas stick to your mind. So I hope you all hear me well, and that you will soon see some of the possibilities, how we can make a change. So there's a goal of this talk, and it is to empower teams together. We've got this empowered concept, and I guess we're all learning more and more about it every day. And we probably don't have the same ideas what it is about, but it's something that we're building together. And how can we empower teams from this point of view that I'm presenting? So it's I'm focusing on resiliency, which is kind of a unknown concept, but it's also something that's being mentioned in other Knowabungas today, or recently with I lost her name, but this woman who usually comes in, Jana Söderberg, who comes in and does talks typically in this direction. And being resilient, it's about staying up and getting back up, but also, of course, having backups ahead of time when something goes down. So an easy guess, what we can do here, we can keep thinking about how we can back each other up. And why would we increase resiliency? It is helpful to get more empowered, and it also helps to stay empowered. So if your team is empowered, but you run into a production issue, like some outage, some bugs, some problems that maybe turn into a big, maybe has some big consequences, there is probably some risk of you or your team losing some freedoms and feeling less empowered. Maybe you get new requirements to check things more thoroughly, you need to document more, and this takes away some empowerment, and it does increase resiliency, but at the cost of probably slowing down. But by having a resilient team ahead of time, it's very likely that you will have a smaller impact from this kind of production outage. And also, if you have a resilient system or product, then these kind of problems will be smaller when they hit you. So resiliency, or being resilient, it works better the more you train. So we need to rehearse procedures and to train your mind and body. So let's do some minor body training. I would like you to raise your arms and do some fist bumps. And now you have better blood flow and your brain will work better. And I hope some of the things coming up will stick better to your mind. There is a concept of human superpowers. You may have seen something like that sleep is a superpower, or else I've got a link to a TED Talk to share with you later. And another important base ingredient in being resilient involves making use of another superpower that is actually listening. And also a third power, let's say, connected, making other people feel seen and heard, and ensuring that everybody gets a chance to contribute. And now a question for you here. What are some other superpowers you've seen in your colleagues? Just shout out if you have some ideas.
Just brilliant.
Yeah?
Self-organization.
Yes, self-organization is a good one. Calmness, thank you.
Help at any moment.
Willingness to help, yeah.
Knowing how to explain.
Knowing how to explain, that's really tricky in many cases. Good one.
The ability to give good feedback.
Giving feedback is really hard, and it's really hard to remember that you should take it as a gift. Getting feedback is kind of, it's one of the more expensive gifts somebody can give you. And I think we can all wish for more feedback, and that means we need to be mindful of giving feedback. So let's hope we can train that at some point. We can probably find some more, but let's go on. So what more can we do beyond using our various superpowers that we know that we have, but we might forget about them? Of course, we can do some changes to processes. So we had the option to test in production. And okay, as consultants, we can say that it depends if this is a good idea or not. But for sure, if you have a situation where you can do experiments in production, this probably means that your system is very resilient, and probably also your team is resilient because they dare to do this. So maybe it's actually a good idea to, in small steps, start experimenting in production, because it's going to grow the other resiliency that you would wish to have. And all right, empowered teams, they would then prefer cattle, not pets. And what's this all about? Yeah, cattle is something that you can declare. Typically, if you have a farm and you have cattle, you would have to declare how many you have and that they are well, what medicines they get and so on. So what procedures have been performed on the cattle. While if you have a pet, you might have some certificates, but it's all very one-off. You do this, you do that. One pet is not alike another one. And you know this from DevOps, this concept, keeping cattle, not pets. So the cattle are something that they are easy to replace as well. Okay, they stay on their path if you're lucky, maybe a bit better than a pet, and easy to recycle. I see duplicate further. And what about some examples of cattle? Well, you probably have some automatically generated passwords in your browser. That's a good way. Do you have some deployed versions of your code or your team's code infrastructure? These might be examples of cattle if we're lucky. On the other hand, maybe you have some pets that if they would be lost or broken would cause trouble. Let's say you have one password that is shared across the whole team, and you don't really know who, because everybody is working remote, somebody's connecting with this password and accessing some resource. Do you know, is this a valid access or not? So probably it would be better that everybody gets an automatically generated password for themselves, or even better, a system that makes sure that you just log in one way and you get some kind of resource, some kind of token, and use that. So yeah, try to replace, if you remember some of your pets, try to replace one or more of these with cattle for greater resiliency. And here are some maybe fun examples of pets. So the pets on the left, they have been named with care, and it means something. Igpay Atninlay, if you Google it, you will find something funny. And somebody spent quite a lot of time on drawing these. Not as much time as some NFTs maybe, or maybe more time than some NFTs. it happens. While on the right, it was a quick brew install cowsay, and then, okay, I used Stack Overflow, but then I got this to work in the manner of shell that I have, and I could automatically generate as many cows as I would need. So easy to get a lot of cattle here. And back to the title, cows and cattle, pets and cattle die. How do we cope? So die is a play of words, and it comes from this distributed or decentralized, immutable, and ephemeral. It's a concept from about a year ago from the security conference RSA in America. And the idea here is that if we have systems that are distributed, then accessibility is kind of taken care of. So the system is not going to be unavailable when you need it. If it's immutable, then even if a virus gets to it and infects it, it doesn't have any effect because it doesn't change. And ephemeral, so it can be there for a short time, disappear, and it can come back, or you can have a different version of it. So I guess we need to keep some kind of versioning or some reference points. There is no trust in this, but you will see that this is supposed to replace the previous concept, CIA. So this is the best bet to avoid the CIA. And CIA is the old way of slicing up security. If you have security, you would say that you can slice it up into confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And okay, availability, it was already mentioned. You understand this. Integrity is kind of immutability, but it allows for changes. So if the integrity of a document is guaranteed, then you know that there has not been any disallowed changes, let's say. Only allowed accesses, allowed changes have been made. But for an immutable document, it's just there. You can even have like a long ago published list of fingerprints of documents. So you're kind of safe. And the confidentiality. Yeah, the idea there was that you somehow control who has access to something. But there is always the analog loophole. So somebody can come with a camera and just slide around and snap a photo of your screen, and they have whatever is on your screen. So it's harder and harder to maintain confidentiality. And let's say if we want to have confidentiality here, the idea is probably that you limit the initial access rather than having the resource always there and then trying to protect it. And now, how do we know where we are and how far we can go with improving empowerment and resiliency? So I have some challenges for you. The first challenge, avoiding password reuse. So now, anybody who has reused a password, hands up. Yes, many passwords, right? Yeah. And the goal here would be to do this less and less, of course. And I think this is the first challenge among many, because if somebody gets access to one of your passwords, and it's going to happen, these systems get broken into and lists of emails or usernames and passwords are just leaking all the time. And you can sign up on this have I been pwned yet, and see when it happens to you. And then you know that you should have already before gone around to all your places and replaced with automatically generated passwords. You get help with this from Google Password Manager. If you go into the menu there and see, it's actually going to tell you these passwords are reused. I noticed the feature because of some routers. So typically the routers would be admin and admin as the login, which is not a good idea. Switch that if you have a router at home. And maybe in a few years we can achieve a level of close to no passwords, because there are ways to avoid having passwords to log in. Something called WebAuth coming on. You might have seen it in Safari or so. And all right, next challenge. We have the idea of using something that you have. And the problem with passwords in general, all these things that is just something that you know, or even as an SMS code, are things that come in and you type them and they go somewhere. And there's a fairly new attack that shows you a browser inside the browser window. So you imagine that you're answering to a login pop-up from Google, but actually it's just like an image or a rendered version of a browser inside the browser that you're looking at, which then steals your login password and SMS code. And then, of course, behind the scenes, it can do whatever it wants with those things. But with anything that you plug in, as yet, the web cannot steal this. There is a standard coming up, Web USB, something like this, and that would make it possible to connect to USB devices, but there will probably be some protections because Google is usually quite good at this. And yeah, that's for now the safest way. And you might recognize this image below, at least anybody already employed in Triton. You probably have one of those in your bag or not. All right. Whatever shall I do? The third challenge. No known insecurities in your system. So there are some surveys now and then, and in some recent large survey from last year, it's repeating yearly, a large amount of people reported knowing about security issues in their products. So it's more than half of products being shipped. The team actually knows that there is something wrong in there that needs to be fixed. And I think we're in there, kind of. The audit, the built-in audit solutions that you might have probably tell you something that you have seen and maybe forgotten about. So take a second look and see if you can, after doing some work on challenge 1 and 2, also spend some time on this one. And last year, as a first, a majority were also reporting that security is growing in importance relative to delivering features. So if ever you had the chance to convince your managers, this is the time. And if you need some statistics, some data to back it up, ping me, I will get you articles for it. And it seems here that a working system is more worth to the customer than one that isn't maybe accessible, and maybe even a system where important data gets stolen and ransomed. Challenge 4. Use a recyclable working environment. The idea here is that if you're a developer, you might have heard about dev containers. It's something that's easy to get started with in VS Code and in some other environments. And otherwise, if you don't work with code, you can still use a recyclable working environment by using, let's say, a web application for writing your documentation or what you work with. And we have more and more web apps. There are some reasons for this, and one among them is that updates are really easy to manage. And if something breaks, the provider can easily fix it behind the scenes. They don't need to ship and show you all the code. They can have a lot of code hidden behind the scenes. So they also get better copy protection, and they probably have less code shipped, which means a smaller surface that can be attacked, let's say. And if you're using a package manager or just any kind of update system, and even with Windows and Mac, you do get updates that you sometimes cannot protect or you cannot defend against these coming in. So if you have a recyclable environment, you just turn it off and on again. What if you need to try out 2 versions of an application or of the product you're building in parallel to look for some bugs or check for the changes. Yeah, if you have this recyclable environment, just spin up 2 of them and compare. And challenge 5, 0 local state hardware. So taking one step out from the working environment, a Macintosh does have a lot of local state. If you run into trouble or if you install something, it's there. Now I have some application on my Mac, cowsay, that I probably don't need to generate these cows, ASCII art. And it makes sense to remove it, but the other option could have been that I could have spun this up in a separate environment and just use it and then throw it away when I'm done with it. And there is hardware that can support this. Typically Chromebooks are really good. So if you have a Chromebook, it's built such that it starts from one system, and when it needs to update, it updates the other version of like the boot solution, let's say. And then it tries to switch over to this one when you restart. And if there's anything wrong with this, it can easily just switch back to the previous one. So you always have 2 options. And that's kind of available on Windows. Maybe with the most recent versions there is something like this, but it's still so much more software in Windows, so it's much more vulnerable. And of course you have a lot of local state there as well. Another thing you could use, if you're not so much into web only, you could use an iPad, and you can configure it such that you can turn it off and on again and it comes back to where it came from. In schools, it's quite common to use an application called Deep Freeze. I think it's probably not free, but you can maybe find something similar, or if you're skilled, you can set it up yourself. And then you get also a machine that even if it does get infected with something that you don't want there, or if it just gets crowded, like the disk is full, what do? Yeah, you turn it off and you turn it on again, and that's it. But then, if there's no local state, where do you keep your work? Yeah, probably you should have it in some automatically versioned system that keeps documents or code. And now to the last part of the title, how do you cope? Yeah, we might have different coping behaviors, and you should probably not shut off your coping behaviors, whatever they are, but lean into them, but then don't let them take over. So I will show you one in the next slide, but there is also a concept, COPE, corporate owned, personally enabled, and this is about devices. So we all get devices from Treton, and we have free access to install things on these devices, which means that they are kind of pets, because you put stuff there, and if you lose it, you're probably not going to be happy. I know somebody who is in Stockholm today who spent more than a year, maybe 2 or 3 years, switching from one phone to the next. And you might recognize some of yourself in this as well. If you're using like Macintosh systems or iPhones or so on, you can typically just move everything from one device to the next. I think Windows has something like this, Samsung has something like this, so it should in theory be very easy to go from one Samsung to the next or one iPhone to the next. But there is something more we can do. We can try to define our hardware in a way similar to how we define our products. So Sebastian Hallén started off making some scripts that use brew and other things to just set up the Mac environment. Whenever he switches computer, he just picks this from GitHub, runs the script, and it sets up all the software he needs. It's actually not tricky to do. And on Windows, there are things like Ninite, and maybe in a combination with Chocolate and these kind of things, you can also get all the software that you need without having to manually install it. Another advantage of installing software through a process is that you actually get it updated as it should. Because if you install Java manually, you don't get it updated. Now, there is another issue here. You might run into trouble that you don't want things to upgrade. This typically happens with a major macOS upgrade. You get some things that change, and suddenly your development environment no longer works. So how do you solve this? Actually, you shouldn't need to solve it, because if we are a couple challenges back, if you have a virtual development environment or working environment or for your documents, then the software is in there and it's defined and the versions are as they should be. So you can just update all your systems as much as you want to surely stay ahead of any security issues and so on, which increases resiliency. Here we have a coping behavior. When starting to build up this presentation, I was thinking that I mean, it's a common situation. You have to get to some goal and you start doing something and get stuck in some detail. So what you see here is some guy, Milo Yip, did a C program that is really complicated. It generates this image out of some curves and boxes and so on. And the tricky part is maybe in here you have some characters that are the ones that are used. Now, if you compile this, and yeah, I would have needed the virtual environment for C++. Installing it locally was so slow that I just canceled and I went online and I found the C compiler online and I ran this code online, but got like a terminal output that I could then copy paste. And if you run this with no parameter or parameter 0 when starting the application, then you get, think, an image that is one step less complex than this. So it's more or less just a shell. And then if you send in a 1, you get this one. If you send in a 2, you get an even more complex image, but it's a little bit harder to see. So this was the most showable, let's say. And yeah, spending time on this and talking about this is kind of a coping behavior. And you should allow yourself to waste some time and to have some fun, but not let it take over, let's say. And yeah, the goal in security, in learning to be empowered, in building resilient systems, there is no final point. You can always move further. So the goal is the path. And we can be empowered. It has even we in the word with capital. Yeah. We have maybe a little bit of time for questions or comments. Do you think you can manage some of these challenges, or would you add some? By the way, all photos are my own, so for once I have copyright-safe photos.
I don't know if I have a question, but it's maybe more of a comment that I found really fascinating the way you tie those ideas together. And I mean, at the outset, I didn't really realize that it's going to go towards security, but it's because it's a very interesting concept to apply more broadly, even the cattle versus pets. Yeah, and it came from DevOps there, of course, but it would be an interesting exercise to think about it just also in terms of team dynamics and relationships, and because you tied it with the concept of being empowered, and I guess part of empowerment is also taking care of these practices, because if you like you mentioned, if you mess up with these practices, it'll get taken away. Yes. So that's definitely a part of it. But what the thought I had was also about how we treat ideas, and I'm not. I guess the way of the cattle. Although I guess you wouldn't normally associate cattle with being empowered, but the way you can tie it together is that you have there are things that you treat as cattle and not precious in terms of the ideas that are shared within the team, and or ideas that you have for your product that you don't want to get too attached to, and you don't want to have, because the pet is in the pet project. I know, and that's a negative connotation there.
Yeah.
But I suppose there would also be some things like maybe like your fundamental principles and the way you work as a team that you would want to treat as pets.
I think the people in the team must be pets. They should be like precious and not meant to be replaceable that easily. On the other hand, from higher management, they might want to have some kind of cattle approach to the teams.
Yeah,
that's the tricky one. But for ideas that you mentioned, that's really cool, because of course it helps if you have a lot of ideas and they're easily replaceable, and you're not married to one idea, and you can switch them and explore. Any other ideas, questions?
Simon, we have a virtual question.
Oh, nice.
Yes. So which of these practices that you listed, which ones of these are you not applying yourself?
Oh, I'm trying, and I promise also to help you try better than this. It's not the last time you hear of the challenges. Oh, I have one question for you, everybody, including the virtual participants. Have you enabled your YubiKey?
Yeah. I like how Jan is looking at it. Jan is controlling.
How many cows were farmed while using this picture?
For this specific picture, I think 3 or 4 were recycled.
Yes, so I have one more question. I guess it is there an alternative concern that one might have, because of with every time you have reproducibility of local state, you have to put it in a server, and usually that means a big corporation. And whereas having some absolute privacy advocates would probably like to keep their local state
data
as rich as possible.
and
Yeah.
data. Of course, you can always you can use Google Drive, but just store things that are encrypted. And there is quite easy to use software to do this. I was quite close to start to using it, but it's a little bit of an inconvenience, so it didn't happen. But yeah, this way you can actually use all of these cloud providers and store your data there, and you can even spread your data among several providers and have it all like mixed together for better resiliency and so on. And you can have it, the system I'm thinking of is built by somebody at Google who made it in an immutable way, and then even if somebody finds this data in the far future, they can do data archaeology, just scan the whole bunch of packages that are files that are stored there, and make a new index of all the stuff and make it searchable and usable. But of course, if it's encrypted, then you can't. So then you need to both have all of these blocks or these files and the encryption key, which could be tied to your YubiKey, and then you're safe. You can send the data wherever, and only you can unlock it.
Simon, what are the security threats of the future that we're not thinking about right now?
Oh, nice one. I would quote Jos Åkesson here. You have to watch out for the unknown unknowns, which is a way of getting away with not knowing actually what is the problem. But I can say what's being seen currently is that there is a really quick weaponization of any new vulnerabilities. So remember, always be upgrading. Whatever comes, just push upgrade.